There is something most people get wrong about the empath personality early in life. They think sensitivity is fragility. They think emotional depth means being vulnerable without any strength. They look at the empath, especially when they are young, and see someone who feels too much, trusts too easily, absorbs too deeply, and breaks too often. And for a while, even the empath may start to believe that story. But what looks like weakness in the beginning is often the early building of a very unusual kind of power. Because many empaths do not start life in emotional comfort. They begin in tension, in unpredictability, in environments where reading the emotional atmosphere around them was not a choice, but a necessity. They learned to study facial expressions before they could even explain why. They noticed shifts in tone before anyone else around them sensed something was wrong. They became deeply tuned in to contradiction, what people said out loud versus what they actually felt inside. And while others were simply moving through their days, the empath was studying human behavior at a level most people never consciously reach in their entire lives. Now, here is where this becomes truly important. What we call emotional pain, when a person endures it with awareness, often turns into perception. And perception, over enough time, turns into wisdom. That difficult childhood, that repeated misunderstanding, that constant experience of feeling everything too strongly, it does not just wound an empath. It trains them quietly, invisibly, beneath the surface. It forces an internal growth that many people put off for decades or avoid completely, because pain has a way of forcing deeper questions. Who can I actually trust? Why do people cause harm to others? What is real beneath the surface of things? What protects inner peace? What truly matters in the end? And the empath, unlike many other personalities, does not just ask those questions in their head. They live inside them. They wrestle with them. They search for real answers, not in abstract ideas, but in lived, emotional reality. And that kind of living changes a person from the inside. This is why so many empaths appear unusually wise as they grow older. Not because wisdom was handed to them, but because their suffering demanded it from them. Think about what happens inside a person when they repeatedly survive betrayal, deep disappointment, exclusion, or emotional chaos. One path leads to bitterness, but another path, and this is where the empath often moves differently from others, leads to refinement. They begin to separate noise from truth, performance from sincerity, surface charm from real character, and simple attention from genuine love. And these separations are a form of intelligence that most people never develop. Most people believe intelligence is only measured by what you can calculate or memorize. But there is another kind of intelligence, one that is born through hardship, and it is the ability to recognize patterns in human nature. Empaths often develop that kind of intelligence early in life. And what begins as hyper-awareness, sometimes even as anxiety and constant overthinking, can grow over time into extraordinary discernment. The child who had to sense danger just by walking into a room becomes the adult who can read other people's motives without being told. The person who once overanalyzed every little emotion around them becomes the one who understands complex human situations almost instinctively. The one who was wounded deeply by deception becomes the person who is rarely fooled by it again. That is not weakness changing shape. That is sensitivity becoming something sharp, something calibrated, something powerful. And here is something even deeper worth understanding. Struggle tends to strip empaths of shallow ambitions much earlier than it does for others. They face the big existential questions younger, while others spend years chasing status, chasing approval, or building a certain image. Empaths often become disillusioned with those things far sooner, because they have already seen up close how hollow appearances can really be. That disillusionment can feel like loss when they are young, but as time passes, it becomes liberation. Because when you stop chasing what is shallow, you begin building on what is real. And anything built on what is real tends to last a very long time. This is why later in life many empaths carry a kind of gravity that others can actually feel when they are near them. It is not loud. It is not performed for an audience. It is not dominance in the traditional sense. It is depth. And depth carries its own quiet authority. People trust them because they can sense they are hearing from something earned, not borrowed. Earned through heartbreak, through years of careful observation, through surviving experiences that pushed them deep inside themselves. And there is enormous strength in people who have gone inward and come back out carrying real understanding. This is what the world so often misses when it misjudges the empath in the early chapters of their story. It mistakes their sensitivity for unfinished strength, when in reality, sensitivity is often strength still in formation, still being shaped by fire. Because to feel things deeply and still stay compassionate is genuine strength. To be hurt badly and still choose wisdom over vengeance is genuine strength. To sit inside confusion and keep searching honestly for truth is genuine strength. And perhaps the greatest of all, to take suffering and turn it into understanding instead of allowing it to harden you. That is rare strength. That is transformative strength. The empath's early pain often creates what philosophers and thinkers have spoken about for centuries, what they call the examined life. And the examined life produces something truly extraordinary in a person. It produces people who are difficult to manipulate, difficult to deceive, and difficult to intimidate, because they have already wrestled with things far deeper than what most people ever face. And people who have faced deeper things are rarely controlled by shallow forces trying to pull them around. This is why the empath often becomes powerful as time goes on, not in spite of the struggle, but precisely because of what the struggle built inside them. The very experiences that once made them feel different, too sensitive, too easily burdened by the weight of the world, were quietly shaping abilities that the world would one day find itself needing. Discernment, compassion, psychological insight, moral clarity, inner steadiness. These are not accidental qualities. These are qualities that were forged through real pressure, and things that are forged through pressure tend to be far stronger than things that were simply manufactured without it. So if you are in the stage of life where sensitivity still feels like a heavy burden, understand this clearly. What feels like pain may also be preparation. What feels like isolation may be depth forming quietly inside you. What feels like being constantly misunderstood may be the natural cost of developing a kind of perception that others around you have not yet grown into. And one day, what once made you feel the weakest may become the very source of your deepest authority. Because the empath does not become powerful when life finally stops hurting them. The empath becomes powerful the moment they realize the pain itself was teaching them how to truly see. And once a person learns to truly see, very little in this world holds the power to control them anymore. There comes a certain point in the empath's life when exhaustion quietly becomes revelation. And this is a turning point that many people never see coming, because younger empaths often carry the belief that love means endless accommodation of others. They believe that being a good person means always understanding everyone around them, always forgiving quickly, always making room for someone else's wounds, their moods, or their dysfunction. They give and give beyond what is healthy because they confuse empathy with personal responsibility for every person they encounter. They assume that if they can feel another person's pain, they are automatically obligated to carry that pain alongside them. And for a long stretch of time, they live exactly this way without questioning it. They over-explain themselves to people who were never really committed to understanding them. They overgive to people who only know how to take from others. They stay deeply loyal to those who violate their trust again and again. They tolerate emotional confusion and instability in the name of showing compassion. And often they do all of this genuinely believing they are keeping the peace. But they are not keeping the peace at all. They are financing dysfunction and calling it kindness. And sooner or later, reality makes that truth completely impossible to keep ignoring. Because emotional overextension always carries a serious cost. It drains a person's clarity. It slowly erodes their self-respect. It creates resentment that hides itself under the appearance of patience. And perhaps most dangerously of all, it teaches the people around them that access to them requires absolutely no accountability. Pay close attention here, because this is exactly where real power begins to emerge. Empaths do not usually develop healthy limits because someone sat them down and taught them about boundaries early on. They develop those limits because betrayal educates them in ways that no lesson ever could. Because repeated exploitation teaches the kind of lessons that theory alone is completely unable to deliver. Because one day, without warning, they arrive at something psychologically profound and undeniable. They realize that compassion without discernment eventually becomes a form of self-destruction. And that single realization changes absolutely everything. Because after that moment, the empath begins to separate kindness from submission. And that separation is a massive shift in how they move through the world. Before reaching that point, they often believed that saying no to someone was a form of cruelty. Distance from others felt like something to feel guilty about. Silence felt like rejection. Protecting themselves felt selfish and wrong. But real maturity exposes every one of those illusions one by one. They begin to understand at a deep level that limits are not walls built against love. They are structures that make healthy, real love actually possible in the first place. And once an empath genuinely sees that truth, their entire way of connecting with others shifts completely. They stop responding to every emotional demand placed in front of them. They stop explaining themselves over and over again to people who have already decided to twist their words. They stop trying to help heal people who are deeply invested in staying wounded. And most importantly of all, they stop confusing giving someone access to them with offering someone true closeness. That one distinction alone is life-changing, because not everyone who has access to you actually deserves closeness. Not everyone who reaches for your energy genuinely honors your value. And not everyone who asks for your understanding is willing to offer anything back in return. Younger empaths tend to learn this truth painfully and slowly. Older empaths carry it quietly in everything they do. And this is where a completely new kind of strength begins to show itself. Not dramatic strength, not loud or aggressive strength, but selective strength, measured strength. The quiet but enormous power to hold back energy in places where there is no integrity present. That is real power, because attention is power. Access to a person is power. Emotional availability is power. And mature empaths stop giving those precious things away without thought or care. They become intentional with where they place their energy, and that intentionality completely changes how others experience being around them. People who manipulate others often lose all interest once empathy finds its boundaries, because there is simply nothing left there for them to take. Why? Because exploitation depends on predictability. It depends on knowing you will always over-explain, always return, always forgive without any real repair, always sacrifice yourself just to keep the relationship from falling apart. But boundaries interrupt that pattern, and once that pattern breaks, unhealthy dynamics lose their grip. This is why people sometimes react so strongly when an empath begins to grow stronger. They say things like, "You have changed," and honestly, they are right. That is the entire point. Growth will always look like a threat to those who benefited from your lack of limits. Always remember that the empath starts to understand that peace is not something you create by keeping everyone around you comfortable. Peace is something you create by refusing to take part in what quietly destroys you. That is a deep psychological shift, and it usually arrives alongside a new understanding of energy itself. Because mature empaths stop treating emotional energy as something without end. They begin to recognize that attention is a resource. Time is a resource. Presence is a resource. And where you place those resources is what shapes the direction of your entire life. This kind of awareness produces a level of discernment that most people never actually reach. They begin asking entirely different questions. Does this relationship feed me or drain me? Does this person genuinely respect limits? Does this dynamic ask me to abandon who I am just to keep it alive? Does my compassion in this situation create real healing, or does it simply allow harm to continue? Those are not small questions. Those are powerful questions. And powerful questions produce powerful lives, because once you ask them with total honesty, you stop living in reaction to everything around you. You begin living with intention. And intentional living is where real personal power begins to take shape. Now something else starts to happen. The empath stops needing everyone to approve of them. This is a massive shift because people-pleasing is very often just a survival response from someone who learned early that disapproval means danger. But as the empath grows and matures, they begin tolerating something they once deeply feared, which is being misunderstood. And when you can sit with being misunderstood without betraying yourself in the process, you become remarkably difficult to control. Because manipulation most often works through guilt, through obligation, through the fear of looking cold or harsh or unloving. But once those levers stop working on you, external control begins to fall away. And this is exactly where the empath starts developing what can only be described as a quiet kind of authority. They speak less, but every word carries more weight. They explain less, but they observe far more. They react less, but their discernment sharpens by the day. Their entire presence shifts because they are no longer chasing acceptance from everyone they meet. They are aligned with something far deeper than approval. They are aligned with self-respect. And self-respect changes absolutely everything. It changes what you tolerate. It changes what you attract into your life. It changes what you walk away from without guilt, and what you simply refuse to negotiate any further. This is why so many empaths in their later years appear calmer, stronger, almost untouchable when you compare them to who they used to be. It is not that they stopped caring. It is that they finally understood that caring without any boundaries at all is just another word for chaos. And so they chose something different. They chose clarity. They chose peace built on truth rather than performance. Something important to understand here is that this is not the empath turning cold. This is the empath becoming precise. There is a real and meaningful difference between those two things. Coldness shuts emotion down entirely. Precision takes emotion and directs it with wisdom. One is disconnection. The other is mastery. And mature empaths move steadily toward mastery. They stop giving from a place of guilt. They begin giving from a place of genuine choice. They stop saying yes just to hold a relationship together. They say yes only where truth and real reciprocity actually exist. That is not withdrawal from the world. That is a form of evolution. And once an empath truly understands that their energy is something worth protecting, their life starts changing in ways that people on the outside rarely understand. Because protecting your energy does not make you less loving. It actually makes your love more honest. It makes your presence feel more valuable. It makes your compassion something that can last. And for perhaps the very first time, it allows you to give freely without disappearing in the process. That is real and genuine power. Because the moment an empath stops believing that self-sacrifice is a virtue and begins understanding that self-respect is a necessity, everything in their world begins to shift. And here is the truth worth holding on to. The people who truly deserve your light will never ask you to burn yourself down just to keep them warm. There is a deep and significant shift that happens when empathic sensitivity reaches maturity. Most people misread this transformation because they assume sensitivity does not change. They believe that if you feel deeply, if you are highly perceptive, if you are emotionally attuned to everything around you, then you will remain forever vulnerable to being overwhelmed. But that is only true in the early stages, before lived experience begins sharpening perception into something far more useful. Because with enough time, something truly remarkable begins to take shape. What once felt like emotional flooding starts organizing itself into discernment. And discernment, in the right hands, is one of the most powerful things a person can possess. When empaths are young, they tend to absorb everything without any real filter. They feel tension in a room, but cannot always trace where it is coming from. They sense that something is dishonest, but then doubt their own instincts before they can act on them. They notice that something about a person does not quite add up, but then explain it away in the name of being compassionate. Their sensitivity is real, and it is active, but it has not yet been trained by life. And untrained sensitivity can feel overwhelming, even destabilizing at times. But life becomes the teacher. Experience becomes the teacher. Disappointment becomes the teacher. And gradually, the empath moves from simply feeling what is happening around them to actually interpreting it. That is an entirely different level of awareness, because now they are no longer just reacting to the emotional currents in a room. They are reading patterns. And human beings are made of patterns. Patterns in how they speak. Patterns in where their words and actions contradict each other. Patterns in how insecurity reveals itself. Patterns in what hidden motives look like when someone is not paying close attention. Patterns in how people behave when they are under real pressure. Most people miss all of this because their focus stays on the surface. They listen to what is said. They respond to how things appear. They are persuaded by a polished presentation. But mature empaths often begin perceiving beneath that presentation. And once you can perceive beneath the performance, you stop being so easily taken in by it. This is not intuition in the mystical way people tend to romanticize. This is psychological pattern recognition developed through real experience. And it becomes extraordinarily powerful, because the empath who has lived long enough and paid close enough attention begins noticing things with striking speed. They notice when charm feels rehearsed. They notice when praise has an agenda hidden just beneath the surface. They notice when guilt is being used as a tool, when silence is deliberate and strategic, when vulnerability is being performed rather than genuinely felt or shared. These are not supernatural abilities. These are perceptions that have been sharpened through repeated exposure. And what repeated exposure builds over time is discernment. Think about how rare that actually becomes. In a world where so many people are easily swayed by appearances and surface impressions, the person who can accurately read what is truly happening beneath the surface holds a significant advantage. That advantage very often looks like calm, because people who genuinely understand patterns are almost never shocked by human behavior. They may feel disappointment, but they are not caught off guard. And there is real power in not being easily caught off guard, because naivety is what makes people controllable. Discernment is what makes people free. This is why so many empaths in their later years become extraordinarily difficult to manipulate. Not because they have become suspicious of every person they meet, but because they have become accurate in their reading of situations and people. That is a very important distinction to hold on to. Suspicion sees danger in everything. Discernment simply sees clearly. One comes from fear. The other comes from genuine perception. And mature empaths move toward perception. They stop automatically assuming that everyone around them must be good because they themselves have good intentions. This tends to be one of the hardest lessons they go through.